Shabbat Shalom, and this is 10 minutes of Torah. Not 9 books of the Torah, although we are on the second book this Shabbat. We begin the second book. And not 11 Israelites who came down to Egypt, because this week's Torah portion tells us there were 70 Israelites who came down originally to Egypt. But 10 minutes of Torah. Now, this week, as I just mentioned, we begin the book of Shemot, the second book of the Torah, also called Exodus in Egypt. And before I talk about the content of the Torah portion, I want to talk about the name. How do we get the names of the books of the Torah? And of course, it also actually applies to each individual Torah portion too. How do we get the names? Well, each individual Torah portion, we only need to worry about the Hebrew, but the name of the book is both in Hebrew and in English, or also actually, I believe it's Latin, some of them. So the first book of the Torah, Genesis or Bereshit. Well, in this case, you can see with Genesis, the English names attempt in one word to describe or to talk about or to make mention of the most significant part of that book. So, Genesis, creation. Exodus, leaving from Egypt. In Hebrew, though, the name of the book, and this is also the same for each Torah portion, the name of the book of the Torah is the first important Hebrew word that occurs in the text. Sometimes it's the very first word of the book or the Torah portion. Sometimes it's as far down as the second verse. Well, in the case of Shemot, it's the second word. And while we say Exodus, we call it Exodus in English, Shemot means names. Ve'ele Shemot, second word, these are the names of the 70 people, which I mentioned earlier, who came down to Egypt. Well, those 70 people begin to prosper. And it tells us at the very beginning of the Torah portion, in chapter 1, verse 8, that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, what does that mean, a new king arose who did not know Joseph? We're actually not sure. It could mean that this king, that Joseph had become forgotten in history. Many people get forgotten in history. Many great leaders get forgotten in history. So maybe he just forgot about who Joseph was and simply was concerned about the Israelites. Or maybe he didn't want to know who Joseph was. He didn't want that institutional memory. He didn't want to know that this Israelite helped save Egypt. Instead, he just looked upon him as an enemy. We're not sure which of those meanings, or perhaps a third meaning if you come up with something. Well, Pharaoh, seeing that the people are multiplying, that 70 has grown and grown and grown, makes what is likely the first attempt at genocide in history. And he does it gradually. Instead of just gathering the Israelites and killing them, he says, here's what we're going to do. When babies are born, if it's a girl, you let it live, because the girl could, of course, become someone who would perhaps be the mother to Egyptian babies. But if it's a boy, throw them into the Nile and kill them. And the Torah relates that that there are two women, Shifra and Puah, and they were the women who would help giving birth, meyeladot, which means midwives. That was the word I was looking for. They don't pay attention. And then we go in the Torah portion to the very famous story of the birth of Moses, because the midwives are not cooperating with what Pharaoh wants. And Moses is born. His mother hides him for 3 months, but at 3 months she can no longer hide him any longer. She places him in the Nile, but not directly in the Nile, but in a basket, floats down the Nile, and Pharaoh's daughter, of all people, sees him and knows it's an Israelite boy and takes him in anyway. And she also realizes that if it's an Israelite boy, he should have an Israelite nursemaid, and so sends word. And who is the nursemaid but his own mother? So Moses grows up in the courtyard of Pharaoh, and his own mother is there. And Pharaoh doesn't realize any of this. Well, it doesn't tell us anything really about Moses' years of growing up. But what it does tell us is that now that he's an adult, he sees an Egyptian taskmaster who is abusing an Israelite slave. And so Moses looks around, seeing nobody. He decides, well, he takes justice, if you will, into his own hands. And then the next day, he sees two Israelites who are fighting. And he goes to break that up. Why do you fight with each other? And they said, oh, who made you our ruler? Are you going to kill one of us like you killed the Egyptian? And Moses realizes that the act is known, and so he flees to the desert, where he comes to a well. And at the well, he sees the daughters of the Midianite priest Yitro, who will become his father-in-law. And shepherds have come and have scared them away. So what happens? Moses goes and gets rid of these shepherds so that they can then allow their animals to drink. And eventually Moses will then marry one of those daughters of the Midianite priest, Zipporah, and he marries her. While Moses is tending the flocks of his father-in-law, he has an encounter with God at a burning bush. That in itself could be very good material for a future 10 minutes of Torah. And God tells Moses that he, Moses, is going to lead the people from slavery into freedom. And the Torah portion, the Parsha, ends with Moses going to Pharaoh and saying to him, of course, that famous phrase, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh's response is to make the slaves work even harder. Now, what is it about Moses that makes him qualified to be this leader? Later on, as leader, as an established leader, the Torah is going to tell us that the greatest quality of Moses is that he is humble. That, though, is later in life. And that's a model for all leaders. Humility should be a part of leadership. Yes, you are a powerful person. You can accomplish a lot. Moses is humble, the Torah tells us. But I don't think those were the qualities, or humility was the quality as to why Moses was chosen, because we see that right here in chapter 2. There are 3 instances that occur that Moses acts on. They are both in chapter 2. The first is in verse 11 and 12. What happens? Well, I mentioned earlier that Moses saw an Egyptian taskmaster abusing an Israelite slave, and he takes justice into his own hands. That's the first act. The second act is a little bit further down, and that is when Moses sees these 2 Israelites fighting and wants to know, why are you fighting? And he tries to break that up. And the third act is when he goes to the well and he helps these women, the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian. He doesn't know who they are. He goes and he helps them out. So what is the Torah telling us? It seems to me that the person who will ultimately be able to lead us from slavery to freedom must be someone for whom injustice is intolerable. And that's who Moses is. These 3 situations show us that when Moses sees something happening that he cannot tolerate, something that is unjust, he has to act. Not just know that it's wrong, but he has to act. And that's what he does. That's what he does with the Egyptian taskmaster. That's what he does with the two Israelites. That's what he does with his future wife, Zipporah. He sees injustice and he has to act. And that is the quality that will permit Moses to lead the Israelites from slavery to freedom. Well, this has been 10 minutes of Torah. Not 9 books of the Torah, although we are on book number 2. There are only 5. And not 11 people who came down, there were Israelites who came to Egypt because there were 70, but 10 minutes of Torah. Shabbat Shalom.